Dr. Mark Jangizi here to Science Moment. Today I'm going to ask, does your community in regards to the abortion debate hold absurd positions as virtue positions? Now, before I get into that, we've got our book, Expressly Human, coming out later this month, 10 years in the making. Wanted to, get your support for Tim Barber and my book. It undergirds why and how free expression works, and it is crucial in understanding the full language of emotional expressions that masks ruin, and that masks, by virtue of everybody having them on, have made it harder for infants and toddlers and so forth to understand what is going on in the world. So let's get back to talked about a couple bad kinds of arguments, logical fallacies that folks in the abortion debate on both sides, sometimes laymen, there's sort of intellectually minded philosopher types on both sides that have sophisticated arguments. I'm not really getting at that. I'm getting at the argument that your neighbor typically has, that often you may have without realizing it. And the slippery slope is a logical fallacy, and people make that on both sides. I wanted to mention, though, another kind of thing, something that we've talked about many times before, is that when you're a member of a community, one that is sort of political, or you're feeling there's certain kinds of notions of righteousness and right, things that should be good, you end up evolving over time certain positions which are extreme, and they end up signaling membership. Those people who say those sorts of things are signaling, it's a sign that they're a member of that community, and the kinds of signals or positions that are selected for to show membership are the stuff that's more extreme, because otherwise somebody who's not a member of your sort of righteous community might say that kind of thing. And same for the opposing group. So the abortion debate is filled on both sides with extremes that are of this kind, and so I think there's no sense in going through these kinds of general, psycho-societal dynamics or the physics of these sorts of things as we've talked about them in the context of COVID, and not trying to analyze them. Hey, is this thing plaguing me, and I'm pro-choice, and I'm pro-life? Now, I think it's clear that it is. At least 50% of the population doesn't have an extreme pro-life or pro-choice view. They might call themselves pro-life because maybe they're more pushing towards like 12 weeks, and after shouldn't be allowed, where someone who's pro-life and not extreme pro-choice and not extreme might think it should be 4 months, let's say. There's lots of differences in there, and they because of the relative degree to which they are valuing bodily autonomy relative to the fuzzy life that's coming into being. There's differences there, but those are what I will call pragmatic but principled decisions. Let me come back to that in a minute, because a lot of folks who are on the extreme sides consider themselves as having principled distinct positions, and anybody with these in-between positions is totally unprincipled, which is exactly opposite of what it at first seems. So first of all, I'm not going to tell you that an extreme pro-choice position that anybody should be allowed to abort a baby at 8.5 months, a fetus, for example, is necessarily absurd, but it's prima facie absurd, right? And I'm also going to say anybody who thinks that a zygote is super obviously a person, that's prima facie absurd. Maybe there's some sophisticated arguments that can argue that that's in fact a baby, but it ain't the one that's slippery slope, a fallacious argument. Maybe there's some sophisticated arguments, but at first glance, both of these are extremes. So let's start with the pro-life view, the extreme pro-life view, which is that even a zygote, just at conception, even a zygote, which is a single cell, is a person, is a baby, is a full-fledged moral human. It's a human life, but not just that it's alive, like living skin, and has human DNA, but it's actually sort of a living being whose identity begins then and forever has that kind of moral sanctity of all human life. Now, the reason that it's in fact at first glance absurd, and people forget that it's absurd because they become part of a community and they start to signal membership. Conception is where life starts, and they start to come up with post-hoc justifications, some of which are often fallacious. Let's just remind ourselves, first of all, a single cell versus your intuitions about a baby, whether it's 8 weeks, a fetus, or whatever it is, where you have fully formed, you've got hundreds of millions of cells, you've got body parts, you potentially have a beating heart, you potentially have eyeballs, you've got beginnings of the brain, you might have brain activity. The difference between this single cell and even a very early ambiguous person case is astronomically different. And to imagine that someone should just immediately have the intuition that this is totally a person and just the same as this 2-month-old is bizarre. Now, it could, again, you could make an argument. It could turn out that you're right, but you can't expect people to walk in and say that, oh yeah, our intuitions totally say this thing. Now, let me give you an example. Suppose that it turned out that there was some particular quirk due to some food or something or some disease that a woman has, or just a genetic quirk, let's say, or let's just a disease that she has, some food that she was having that caused, when she got pregnant, instead of it splitting into 2 and 4 and so forth, instead, when it split into 2, it split into 2 twins, identical twins. And then those just had a propensity, those created 2 more twins, and so you've got 4, and then you've got 8, and this happens 33 times. Now, the reason I picked 33 is that you end up with 2 to the power of 33. This is exponential growth. So you end up with around 8 billion individual zygotes that are all fertilized, and they're all identical twins inside this woman. All right? You've got 8 billion in there. This is more than the number of humans on Earth. Now, it turns out that she's not going to be able to, grow all of these. In fact, most of them turn out to die, and if she's lucky, if maybe there's 2 or 3 that survive and make it to birth. But if you are of the belief that there is no ethical distinction between a zygote and a full-fledged person, however you want to define that, or a baby, or whatever it is, then you would be committed to saying that was the biggest tragedy, that is the loss, the eventual abortion, sort of accidental, just organic abortion of these 8 billion. That was the biggest tragedy that the Earth has ever seen. The biggest human tragedy that the Earth has ever seen. Now some of you might say, oh yeah, but I've got the view that conception is where it starts. So it definitely is. No, that's not how you play these games. If you're going to have the whole point about thought experiments is not just to go to your theory and say, oh, my theory says that, so I hereby agree. No, none of us have intuitions that tell us that this is the greatest human tragedy that's ever occurred. It is clearly not at all the greatest tragedy that has ever occurred on Earth. You know it, right? You're beginning to lie to yourself. You're creating games all wrapped around this particular viewpoint you have, conception, and possibly that you got there by virtue of a logical fallacy. That's an extreme position. The natural first intuitions walking in is like, well, I don't know what a zygote is, but it's the first step probably in just building something. When you want to go out and build a complicated thing, the most complicated thing in the universe, it doesn't just come into being all at once, right? The first thing you do when you're building a building is you start construction, you start clearing the way, there's all this scaffolding that has to go up, and it might take 2 years to build the building, and that doesn't mean that on the first day, despite there being a lot of momentum, it's going to keep going, just keep building this building. It doesn't mean on the first day you have the same ethical status as you do once you've got the final building there. Anything that is complicated requires building, and just the very first step in that building process doesn't mean that you have the same moral status as you eventually do later once it's built. So again, I'm not saying there aren't philosophers that could argue that, look, no, it turns out that for lots of other kinds of reasons, it's still a full-fledged human life, but you're going to have to come up with some incredibly sophisticated arguments to overcome what is prima facie, obviously, a ridiculous viewpoint that this one cell should be identical in ethical status as a baby. Now, on the other side, the Democratic Party still has this idea that a woman should be allowed to choose up into the day before it's delivered, which is obviously absurd. I mean, there's a baby. There's just no way to argue that there's not a baby there. Sure, it's a fetus, but it's a baby. As is the case for all concepts, all complicated concepts, which is everything from, again, baldness and cup. There's always clear cases, and then there's gray areas in between, and then there's clear not cases where they're negative. Here we have clear opposite cases where it's clearly a baby at 8.5 months as the fetus, and clearly not a person. It's just a single cell, right? And each side, the extremes of each side, have come to have this position that no, it's totally not a baby up until 8.5 months, and you should be allowed. And the other side, these are clearly absurd. Again, I mean, maybe you can come up, but you have to remember that communities have a propensity to evolve their way toward having these extreme positions, and then they post hoc justify them after the fact. That is, the community over time says, well, this is what works as a signal. No one's saying this. This is what works as a signal to show membership. And then some people in the community create justifications for why that's in fact the righteous view to have. This happened for masks, an earlier science moment we talked about this. This happens for all the kinds of things that happen in communities. And the abortion debate is a great example because you see it on both sides. 50% of the population isn't one of those extremes. And whether they call themselves, I don't know whether to call myself pro-life or pro-choice, it's somewhere in between. And I'll make it this is where I wanted to get to this principled versus unprincipled distinction. A lot of people say, well, I'm really principled about this, and so, it's bodily autonomy drives the entire thing. Okay, well, that's not sounding very principled. That just sounds stupid, because there's also an eventual life. When exactly it starts is unclear and so forth. And the other side is like, it is just totally clear. There's a baby in there. I'm like, yeah, but there's bodily autonomy too, and there's potentially months before there's even a baby in there, even anything that you could remotely call a baby. There are two key principles that matter in society. We don't want to have violations of the federal government in people's private affairs. This is something that all of us agree with, and hopefully you've seen more than ever over the last 2 years the dangers of this. And of course, the pro-choice side is like, this is all about bodily. No, it's not all about bodily autonomy. It's about there's a life eventually growing in there at some point as well. The principled position is the pragmatic, ugly, messy one, because the principled position is one that understands that all concepts have gray areas in between, and when it starts to get gray and when it ends to get gray is itself not clear, and there's more than one principle at stake, and they have to be balanced. And we, just like all of these concepts, we don't know exactly where the balance point is. So the principled way ends up being pragmatic. And people with slightly different values might push it in different directions. But that's the complexity of life. The stuff pushing on either end isn't truth. This is the stuff driven by psycho-societal dynamics. And if you have one of those extreme views, odds are you're suffering from them. And that was your science moment.